As I noted earlier, the Russian occupiers in southern Ukraine have an acute shortage of personnel to provide a full defense along the entire front line, which is now convulsing. Therefore, they are reinforcing only certain locations. If we look at what kind of resources, from where and where they have been moving over the last 2 weeks, a very interesting geometric phenomenon emerges, namely, I will conventionally call it a parallelogram of Russian occupants. Basically, the concentration of forces and means of the enemy takes place within the second and third lines of defense of Zaporizhia region. But at the same time, given the density of defense lines and concentrated personnel, this entire mass is resting on the administrative border of the temporarily occupied peninsula of Crimea. Even from the left bank of the Kherson region, they are pulling in units to reinforce this particular parallelogram. From all of the above, the question arises, but what will happen to the weakened areas that remain outside of this figure? After all, it would seem that that is where the most impenetrable defense of the Russian troops will be. But there is a nuance, and who says that this geometry is precisely for defense? Despite the concentration of forces and resources there, this whole geometry is designed not so much for defense to the last drop of blood, but rather, for the safest unhurried, systematic, but escape. And the defense lines that are now being built on the territory of Crimea, are direct proof of that. There is no way the Russian contingent on the peninsula will be able to hold those defense lines that are being built in Crimea. But on the other hand, this entire defense architecture will make at least some sense only if they receive an inflow of up to 100,000 personnel. That is why it is obvious that the Russian command has long realized that they will not be able to hold the south, but they will try to imitate a desperate heroic defense for as long as possible, which is why they see a parallelogram as the best way to stretch the process. I'd also like to make a note of the increase in the number of enemy Ka-52 attack helicopters destroyed. In May the enemy had a record 553 artillery pieces destroyed. In the first half of June the Ukrainian forces have already destroyed 373 units. It would seem that what does artillery have to do with attack helicopters? It has something to do with it. In a month and a half the Russians have lost a huge number of artillery pieces, without which they are not only unable to attack, but even to defend. Naturally, they urgently need compensation for the losses, which cannot be compensated through withdrawal from storage and lame logistics. And therefore helicopters come into play. A similar scheme worked on the right bank of the Kherson region, when the Ukrainian defense forces began to destroy Russian artillery non-stop, and logistics did not allow them to compensate for losses. Attack helicopters began to act as artillery, launching attack missiles at Ukrainian positions using the method of a sharp climb with a nose up. And so a similar tactic began to work in the south. There is a critical shortage of artillery, which means that attack helicopters, which more and more often have to come close to the front line and get into the coverage of Ukrainian air defense and mobile groups with manpads, are coming into play. The enemy's situation is consistently bad, and these fools were going to war with NATO. And if anyone thinks that it is not bad, I would like to remind you that the stage of capturing Kyiv in 3 days has changed to the stage of Afu advances and something happens on Russian territory.